All right, thank you, Kim. First off, Kim, can you see my screen?
Yes, we're good.
All right, perfect. Thank you all for joining. This is our second webinar for the year around cybersecurity, and we wanted to bring to your attention one of the cybersecurity controls that we have talked about a lot in the past, NAC, or Network Access Control. Before we get started, for those of you who don't know me, let me introduce myself. I'm Mishaal Khan, cybersecurity solutions architect and practice lead at Mindsight. My background is I'm a highly technical person. I'm a CCIE in routing and switching. So subjects like this are very relevant to my field, talking about network access. I'm a certified ethical hacker, so cybersecurity is very, very near and dear to me. I follow best practices when it comes to cybersecurity, privacy. I do a lot of open source intelligence as well. I've had 15 plus years experience across the globe, Middle East, Asia, here in the US, working with all sorts of SMBs, government, education, you name it. All one thing common between almost all these organizations is cybersecurity. Everyone needs it. Their requirements may differ, their mileage may differ, but the basic requirements are pretty much the same. Today's agenda is very simple, very focused. We talk about NAC, its importance, why we need NAC, some of the basic functionality, competitive landscape, and in my opinion, what the buying criteria should be. We've set this up as a non-technical type of presentation, a high-level overview, because I've realized NAC is it's a complicated solution. It's been out for decades now, yet adoption level is very low, and we want to understand some of those pain points and why it is. Hence, we've put forth a presentation like this, which goes over more of the value proposition on why we need it and what it really is. So before we get into the solutions and NAC and what it is, the basic question here is why? Why do we talk about NAC? My answer to this is initially, I've had a discussion with most of our clients around security frameworks, and we talk about the CIS20 controls that you see on the screen. It's basically a set of the top 20 functions and controls within cybersecurity that we need to address in order to increase our security posture. Within these controls, it talks a lot about network access, visibility, control. Most of those things are basic definitions of what NAC is. Like within this chart, you see a lot about inventory. NAC handles a lot of that. It talks about limiting ports and access and controls, a lot of the technical stuff around the network. Well, a NAC type of solution deals with that as well. So when I consult on any framework, whether it's NIST, CIS, HIPAA, NAC plays a very fundamental role in multiple domains across these functions. So you get a lot of bang for your buck with by focusing on NAC alone. But that's high level. That's why we basically focus on a NAC solution. Next up is the functions. What is NAC? I mean, what functions does it fulfill? What checkboxes does it check in a security compliance framework? Visibility is the first thing. I've always said, if you don't know what you have, what are you trying to protect, and how do you protect it? So visibility is a big thing. NAC really gives you that insight into the devices, into stuff like location, posture of the devices, whether the device should be quarantined or not. So a lot of those things fall under visibility, and then you can control what you see. You can form a baseline and say, this is normal for my organization. If anything deviates from the normal, put some controls around it. When it comes to compliance, it also enforces a lot of the compliance checkpoints there. So some of those things fall smack under this type of big solution. And it encompasses a lot. And there are a lot of players in the market that have been doing this for some time. Here's just a screenshot of some of the big names out there, some of the popular names. By no means is this an exhaustive list. There are 50 or so vendors that are known that are out there. Some of the big players, you'll see big names like Fortinet is here, who are our guests today and our main presenter. There's Extreme Networks, Forescout is well known, Cisco ICE is very well known within the Cisco world. Aruba and HP joined forces for their NAC solution. There's a few others, and most of these are for enterprises. There's Packet Fence, that's a free open source based solutions. So you'll see all sorts of solutions for SMBs, for enterprises, for government, for open source communities, nonprofits. There's a solution for everyone. Our focus today is on Fortinet, because it sort of covers a large breadth of sizes and requirements. The main thing here is, the questions that most people ask: which solution should I be looking at? What scalability should I be looking at? What are the feature sets and all those things? My answer to this is this short checklist that I came up with. When you're trying to look for a solution, look for integration. Does it integrate with your existing infrastructure that you have in place, hardware, software, all those things? Because if it doesn't, you're going to have to buy more stuff and more issues. So that's the main thing there. Does it work with your solution? Interoperability, same thing. Visibility, how much visibility do I get? Every solution focuses on something different. Some that are network-based solutions may focus only on the network side of the visibility, but may not focus on the VM world, and so many other use case scenarios. Enforcement, how much does it enforce? Compliance, does it fulfill some of my compliance requirements? And features are endless. Every solution has a whole set of features. Some of them you may not need, so this is why we need to have that discussion and define some of those feature sets. Deployment complexity, it can go anywhere from simple to complex, but this is why you have partners like us to take on that load for the deployment. And obviously pricing is a big factor. Support, in my opinion, is also very important. You don't want a solution that's not well supported, or it's new in the market and they're still discovering themselves, or it's a free open source based solution with only community based support. You want something that's well supported. At the end of the day, this is a matter of compliance and security of your network. So that was my brief introduction here. We'll have breaks for questions in between. Feel free to add your questions to the chat box in WebEx, and I'll hand it over to Jeff in a bit. But Jeff will pause for questions halfway through his presentation and towards the end. So please ask questions. When Jeff pauses, you can unmute yourself and ask those questions as well. And we have some Amazon gift cards to give away for the top questions that are asked. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff. Jeff is our presenter today from Fortinet. He is our subject matter expert in NAC, and I'll let him introduce himself. So Jeff, I'll make you presenter. I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm Jeff Sadecky, a solution architect with Fortinet, and I'm here to do the presentation. Very much appreciate Mindsight having us being the sponsor presenter for a very important technology like network admission control. Sharing my screen here. So the content of what I want to go through today is obviously about seeing and controlling what's on your network, and our solution set is Fortinet. A brief 30-second bio about myself. I've been with Fortinet for about 2.5 years, NSE 1-7 certified, and my role is to support partner and channel development in the North Central US. So assisting partners with webinars like today is important and critical, and being up to speed on all the products and technologies to make Mindsight more familiar with our product set, to make you and offer solutions to you, right, to better enable your security posture and capability. Much like Mishaal, I also am a CCIE certified, although my number is quite a bit lower. CCIE 20 did achieve that way back in 2001, held it active for 10 years, and I did work at Cisco for 17 years from 96 to 2014. So some really good relevant experience, as you can imagine, in networking and security. So in looking at, right, why is it important to see and control what's on your network? Well, as we kind of already set the stage, is you can't have a complete security posture if you don't know what's on your network. I mean, that's paramount for what one of the prime aspects of what network admission control does. Throughout the presentation, I like to use analogies. Hopefully, they're relevant, not too corny, of things you're familiar with that would help understand and apply what the technology is that we're talking about. And because I recently filled out the 2020 census, and yes, I was probably late for doing that, it reminded me an example of how you could apply to better understand NAC. So as we know, every 10 years we fill out a form and provide critical information, right, for planning of funding for services and so on and so forth. Well, think of NAC as a continuous census of your network and what's on your network so you can control it. So it helps, the next two slides, right, to set the stage, right? Why are we having a NAC conversation? What is it? And frequently, Fortinet, when we do an overview presentation, we talk about the trends in the industry, such as the digital transformation leading into a security transformation. So the digital transformation was all about digitally enable everything, right? So many more devices are connected on the network. IP is for the most part the ubiquitous transport protocol for that. And then with that, right, it's no longer, way back in the day when I was a system administrator for an IBM mainframe network, right? That's a closed network, right? That's extremely, it's from a top-down type of scenario, right? Things are planned and terminals are disseminated and so on and so forth. Now it's always from the bottom up. That you have networks and devices. Of course, you're putting out infrastructure for computers and laptops to be connected, but now there's much more plethora of things like Internet of Things that would be coming onto your network. So the security parameter is no longer easily defined, once again, where it's at. I like to use the term PDD, which is personal digital devices. They're common on the business network. This slide, as a reference, right, talks about the Internet of Things, which for organizations, you have to improve your visibility into what's attached onto your network. You need to know every device and every user accessing your network. IoT devices, as we know, enable digital transformation initiatives, and they improve efficiency because you can have the applications and flow and the flexibility and optimization. But they are inherently untrustworthy. The designs for many of the devices were to prioritize low cost over security, right? So there's minimal aspects of a security engine or functions within the particular device. And as I reviewed the slide deck, it was obvious that one IoT device has come and gone, and it's staring right at you. And the Google Glasses, while it was a fad, a phenomenon, right, to be explored, maybe it'll come back in some form or fashion in the future. But it does exemplify the fact that current device profiling, right, because there's so many more different applications from the Internet of Things that can be coming onto your network, you'll see that a key feature of network admission control, specifically Fortinet, is to be able to understand and learn what the device is. So also referencing the slide, right, it's probably not going to be a common threat scenario that someone's walking in with their smart fridge, but the overall Internet of Things paradigm does include that. What else can we consider that would be more germane to your network cybersecurity? And that's the convergence of operational technology and informational technology. And this has had and is a significant impact on manufacturing cybersecurity. So if any of you on the call are in this, you're probably well aware of what I'm talking about. So industries have ICS, which is an acronym for Industrial Control Systems, and SCADA, which is an acronym for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. So these are systems that have historically been air-gapped, you know, totally separate. They were oblivious on their own, right? A dedicated separate network with their own infrastructure and support and so on. But now they're being adding IT stacks to them, so they're being connected onto the IT system, and therefore your intranet and possibly the intranet. So as the air gap is removed, right, the systems are being IT enabled. The result is that operational technology systems are becoming a vulnerability, a huge vulnerability of what could be attacked on your network. So as the slide builds out, I always like to say it only takes one bad guy or one nefarious person to be successful one time to, you know, help justify, if you need to, you know, prove that point, or why you need to have a defense in-depth NAC system so that you can be successful all the time, right? The hackers just need to be successful one time, but you need to be successful all the time. So we've heard the phrase, what's in your wallet? But germane to this discussion is, what's on your network and how do you know? I think we can probably all step back and realize with the rapid growth of adding networks, segments, and devices, the documentation of all the IT and IoT devices could be a blind spot. It's safe to say that the business functionality is based on IP networking. It's an asset of your company, but it's also a liability. Speaking of assets, and another analogy, it wasn't all that long ago that organizations, especially in retail, right, they would shut down, you know, usually the end of the year, and to take inventory of the assets. So another way to think of what Fortinet is doing, it's a continuous inventory of your network devices. And depending on, you know, another consideration for NAC is you may be in a vertical where auditing and reporting is extremely critical. And this is the power and the flexibility of collecting all this information, which we'll do a deeper dive on, allows the ability to provide the audit reporting and perhaps meet PCI compliance in your network. So we do appreciate the fact, and it was opened up, right, this is more of a general overview of NAC solutions, but I'm going to take some liberties here and give you a slightly more myopic view, a point of view from Fortinet's perspective. So if you're not familiar with Fortinet, we have developed about 4 years ago what we refer to as the Fortinet Security Fabric. And it is a system of our components being integrated and working better together. So once again, about 4 years ago, engineering and marketing from Fortinet says, you know, we've got all these great products, but the problem is security is becoming so paramount among all organizations. We need to help realize and have them realize and offer solutions that it's not about individual point products, you know, that could be considered best of breed or secondary best of breed or whatever, of developing and bringing all these in. Let's make sure all of our products have a synergy and a system and an architecture to work better together. So that architecture is the fabric where our products are broad to address the variety of the digital attack surface that's integrated and automated. So on that timeline, right, so the fabric was about 4 years ago. Fortinet in itself is about a 20-year-old company. And on that time frame, 2 years ago, exactly, in fact, to this day, a news alert internally came out that it was 2 years ago, to this day, June 4th, that Fortinet acquired Bradford Networks. So that was the company that we acquired to become Fortinet. A point of clarification or just general knowledge about Fortinet is most of our products are developed and engineered in-house. You know, we're very much an engineering company at the core of our DNA. So acquisitions are fewer and far between and are intended to meet, you know, time to market capabilities, certainly acquiring intellectual property, patents, and so on. And Bradford Networks is about as old as Fortinet is in its development. So it's it was very much a leader at the time in its award-winning network century solution for the discovery of every endpoint in the network infrastructure device, providing contextual awareness for implementing dynamic access control, and so on. So within that fabric, we talk about how we can break it out and offer discrete solutions. And one of them, now looking at, the circle, and I frequently, when I describe the fabric, and this is, not a fabric discussion of Fortinet, but you look at the vertical axes, so like from the 12 o'clock down to the 6 o'clock position, right? That's the core of what we have. At the top is the management, and the bottom is the security operations, for reporting. And then various points are shown what can be connected. Well, at the 9 o'clock position is what we refer to as our endpoint device and protection. So that's a series and set of products and services necessary to provide secure user and devices connecting to the network. First and foremost with that is the solution set of NAC. And if you're not familiar with Fortinet, if you haven't caught on, basically every single product and service begins with 40, so it's Fortinet. And then also, just for further edification knowledge, right, a part of the solution set for that is we have client capabilities and the management functionality of EMS, variety of platforms that can run on. We also have a client for endpoint detection and response, referred to as FortiEDR. In the bigger picture, just generically, you would always consider, I want my clients to be able to have in your web services, right, for connectivity, two-factor authentication. So those particular products are FortiAuthenticator and FortiToken. Now, I'm sure we recall from our, how to write a good news story is you consider the quad W's and sometimes how, right? The who, what, when, where, why, and how. Well, that's also applicable. This paradigm, right, is also applicable when you look at what the importance of visibility is for a NAC solution. Because as we build out, it's like, where are my network segments? Is it a VPN connectivity? Is it wireless? Is it switched? How do I connect up in that? Who are the users? Most importantly, it may not be just an individual discrete person, but it could be machine authentication. How to identify who the user is coming onto the network? And then what is the device? And then certainly most organizations standardize on a set of operating systems for that. So you can define, our standard operating system is Windows, this particular version. And if there are variants to that coming in for what is actually operating, right, that's part of what you want to be notified and report on and control. And certainly a paradigm which is sometimes achievable, but usually more difficult. But now if you can have a pervasive overview of your entire network and the connections within a NAC control system, you can also apply time-based control mechanisms for that. So playing along with our, as I mentioned before, that the quick and easy ways of the key subsets of what are the functions, like the who, what, when, where, right? And this one I refer to as we have the double I and the double A, right? The function of, if you're controlling it, you first want to identify who the user is and the device, and then you want to move into an element of, well, what associated risks might be involved with that, and assign the network access. Now, it's easy to remember as this builds out, right, that this should happen every time a device is connected. As unfortunately, we must adopt and think about a zero trust networking stance. Even though I logged in, the day before, and generally through this particular port, there's always the suspect or the capability that an unsuspecting internal person may have had their laptop compromised and not even know it, right? Bringing in and having an associated virus on the laptop. So here as we build out, right, so we've identified who the user and device is, we've determined that their security posture is up to date, and then we can go through a mechanism of deciding there's no access, or hey, I want to easily deploy the ability for guest users to come in and have a portal assigned to them where they can quickly provide credentials and give them a limited guest access, or I'm still in the phase of determining internally, what this new device is. So I'm going to put them on a restricted access network where they can get to internal resources, maybe to get their laptop updated, get new software builds installed, and then further moving into what we would assume you generally want for your production users is having unrestricted access. So I'll pause here and see if there's any questions that have come up. Certainly want to take advantage of the users that have joined the webinar to get your gift card. So if there are any questions, please speak up.
Hi, just a housekeeping note. On the bottom right of your screen, there's a Q&A box. You can feel free to type in your questions in there, or you can raise your hand in the feedback section. So 2 options. I know a lot of people prefer typing over speaking.
Go ahead and interrupt me. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me quickly ask one question around how do I word it right? So what vertical or target market does Fortinet play best in? Because I mentioned earlier about the different types of solutions out there. Some more focused for government, SMBs, large, small organizations. What's the sweet spot for Fortinet?
Well, there's several sweet spots. Of course, I'm not going to blatantly limit, to what the product can be sold and supported for. But in general, from the history of where Bradford Networks, right, the legacy of that system, it was very strong in education and healthcare. The capabilities for identifying, especially for education, right, the users coming in and automating the aspect of getting the appropriate users, teachers, students, staff on the right network was paramount. And then healthcare, right, with and you'll see this at the end of the presentation, one of our reference customer examples was a healthcare institution, and so many more layers of compliance generally have to go along with being in the healthcare industry, that the reporting capability was important for that. But as far as size, I mean, we can go from a very small installation to a very, large global type of infrastructure with dissemination of devices in the appropriate network. And I think it's just one more soundbite, and you'll see the slides coming up, right? It's not based on any particular like 802.1x, some solution sets might kind of, while that's a standards base, drive you down to using that particular supplicant. That's not a requirement for our system.
We have a question in the chat. It's a very good question that I also had initially when I was introduced to multiple products. It's by Edward Clark. Would the devices have to be running Fortinet software, or is this hardware scans? Basically, talking about network devices.
Very good question. No, there's no supplicant that needs to be installed. There is an option that you can put supplicants on devices for further information, but it's not at all required. We use, and you'll see this coming up in the slides, we use standards-based protocols for going out and determining what the devices are, and then the ability to go in and query laptops, right, and look at the information being provided by the operating system, what the operating system is, what particular features are installed, software, and so on. So no additional software needs to be installed.
I guess to follow up to that, I guess it makes sense because when you mentioned all the IoT devices, you can't really install anything on IoT devices. They're vendor locked. So you're running basically scans like Nmap scans or DNS and all those other things. I guess you have it in a slide.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very good point. So a little bit more of a myopic view, as I talked about, from a Fortinet's perspective for the capabilities, but I think certainly the visibility control and the response, I think your opening slide talked about compliance, but that's tied into reporting type of capability. So I think our overall architecture of refer to it as VCR, right? It's the visibility control and response. I'm skipping the automated, but anyway, you know, definitely ties into that general framework of what NAC is. Now, this slide is saying security in the world of IoT, but I think it's also security for the success of your business. You know, IoT has been a very powerful driver and why it's been needed, but we're really talking about network visibility to see every device and user as they join the network control to limit where devices can go on the network, and an automated response to speed the reaction time to events from days to seconds for devices that may be coming in, may have a suspect vulnerability, may not have the current version of a patch of an operating system that you want in your environment. So the function of visibility, if you think about implementing, moving forward with, because it's so comprehensive in discovering and finding everything, you know, I mentioned earlier the documentation, right? As the network segments have grown, it's hard to keep track of all the different devices sitting out there. You have, if you're a larger organization, maybe you have the physical security department, which is rolling out IP-based cameras, right? It's a function of the business, but they're not directly related to security and functionality, but you want to be able to provide and identify what those devices are. So the visibility component is kind of in a pre-production and a post-production stage. And I say pre-production because there's a little bit of time, as you can imagine. A larger network, we have to pervasively, for lack of better words, crawl the network and determine all the devices that are sitting out there. But the benefit of doing that, once it's done and you go into a post-production, you now have a database of every single network element in your environment. Using the business analogy again, with regard to applications and data, I'm sure you've got databases. You've probably got multiple databases used in your applications, your reporting, and so on, but you probably don't have a database of all the critical components in your infrastructure, which is running your business. So from the discovery phase and the visibility, this is where you're going, right? Everything is collected and is in a huge database with ability to granularly search, find, facet, and filter on particular components. So the slide tying into the question that we just paused for about does it require software? It does not. It's an agentless data collection. Now, if you're non-technical, some of these abbreviations may be foreign to you, but really the takeaway is there's standards-based ways to access and retrieve information from a variety of sources, and these standards-based methods have known definitions of how to use them. Everyone would be familiar with SNMP, functions of radius. If you have an infrastructure, if you've got all your infrastructure is Cisco routers and switches. Well, we have a huge database of being able to implement and understand the command line interface, regardless of the software version. So if we know we need to interact with a set of Catalyst switches and the Catalyst OS, we have the capabilities to know once you enter the credentials within the network control system of NAC, we can go out and query the switches, receive the CAN tables, or the information about who the users are and connecting onto that. Just to break out a couple acronyms if you're not familiar with them, SIM is Security, Incident, Event Management, and IPS are basically the same. It's Intrusion Prevention Systems, right? Just a variety of sources sitting out there, network devices, doesn't have to be Fortinet, that we can query and get the information to develop into the database. So how is that done? Fortinet has a profiling rule. It's part of the, the pre-production where there's a set of rules that are already defined in the profiling that would go out and help identify, what are switches. Well, I'm going to look for standards-based profiling rules that are compared against each and every known and unknown device that is found on the network. And when a device matches a profiling rule, and I'm talking about device, so think of a switch, an access point, a firewall, whatever, a router, we're determining, we're learning. It's like, ask a question on the network, what are you? The SNMP replies back with standards-based information. So now the device is registered. I put my database in Fortinet. I know what the unique device type is, and then I can move in and develop roles. Another important criteria, very powerful, is I've got so many different devices out there. I just would like a report and specific functionality to occur that I know, using my example before of the physical security team implementing IP cameras. Well, as soon as I know and understand what that camera is, I want it to go on its own unique network. That's what Fortinet can do, is the visibility and control. And then as long as that network is provided to wherever that camera may be plugged in, it'll automatically be reassigned into that specific role and network segment. So you can have groups along with that. So the profiling rules can be configured, can require, there can be various levels of management and approval for that. So you can have approval mechanism for the authorization of the device. So some things have been discovered. It's like, hey, we've got some new devices who in the department may be implementing these, it's a newer version of something, or it can be automatic. So there's the variety of these methods for profiling that can occur. One of them, if you look at it, if you're not familiar with what vendor OUI is, that's your vendor. So you plug in every single thing that has an Ethernet, let's just say Ethernet connection. The first time it communicates, or any time it communicates on the network, the first part of that network communication is telling the network, I came from Fortinet, I came from Cisco, right? It's your organizational unique identifier. Now, nefarious individuals have figured out the fact, it's like, oh, that's just, I can fake that. I can modify code, so when that little packet goes on the network, I'm going to make believe that my communication flow looks like it's coming from a printer, when in fact I'm a workstation. So the analogy I like to use when describing how that vendor OUI and faking that is, I'm sure we've all been hit up with, you receive a telephone call and it's your same area code and prefix as your number. Well, that's what spam callers are doing, is they're faking out, right? They're identifying, they're learning. It's like, hey, there's a subset of area codes and prefixes. I'm going to send out this call. We look at it, it's like, oh, that looks just like my number. I'm going to pick it up. And that's kind of what the reference example I'm giving when it talks about one of the methods of identifying is via the vendor OUI, the MAC address, and how that can be used to spoof the protocol flow. Another example I like to use is somewhat relevant, right? It's just that identification, that visibility phase. And it applies, it's a little bit of a stretch, but I think we're all familiar with, you go to a new website, right? And then they want you to create an account. Well, you can either create an account on their site and it's your email and you come up with a password, or it asks you, do you want to use Google, Facebook, or LinkedIn as a site which you can log on with those credentials. So you're trusting a third party to provide my authentication and profile information for that. So another way to kind of think about what we're doing, right, is we're helping to ease and understand who the users are. Comprehensive network security. So once you've identified all the devices sitting out there and, protocol flow, maybe talking about, hey, I'm a printer sitting in that, but changes in activity is important to understand, because once again, we always have to, unfortunately, consider that everything is a zero trust network boundary. So a masquerading technique is the fact, as I given before, right, is I can spoof my MAC address, my vendor OUI, pretend I'm a printer, so NAC would put me on or have that functionality. However, even though I said I'm a printer, I don't act like I'm a printer, because my applications, my ports, and my protocols don't support it. So the changes in activity is an important ongoing, right? I'm continuously assessing my network of what's happening. So automated response is the function of how do I better enable, right? Moving up I've developed my database, my information and reporting. I know about my my network flows and my users and my applications and so on. And then moving the bar up is part of, well, the fabric functionality is that automation function. So within licensing features of Fortinet, we have the capability to move into a full-blown reporting function. So you've identified a network laptop coming in, doesn't have the appropriate virus software support on it. What do I want to do? I want to automatically quarantine it. The next two slides visualize, kind of what I've been talking about at a high level, the device profiling, pictorially seeing, the printer is connected to the network. I'm receiving, right? So it physically connects to the switch. The switch will notify Fortinet. I have a new port that's come online, and I have information about it. And the Fortinet says, okay, I see the printer. I'm going to allow it and provide printer type access to the network. The aspect now of lateral threats. So that's, east to west in general, right? If you come onto the network, unfortunately, my laptop got infected or it has a command and control botnet on it. And we can further have the information, right, for the automated response to say that I've identified a particular aspect of your laptop and I want to move in and quarantine that. So this is just a second slide is just, going through the top half is basically the same as what I've shown before, and the bottom half is what I've been referring to, where your laptop is spoofing, pretending to be the connection of a printer. It goes up to NAC, but then it profiles it as a non-printer. And what's happening there? Well, remember, even though it came in, those very 17 levels that we talked about before, besides just looking at and identifying what the vendor OUI is, I'm going to look at and query the particular function of that user and see how it responds. If it responds differently than what I would expect the printer to respond, I'm going to quarantine that device and put it in a separate area. So our key platform differentiators for our NAC solution is extremely broad device awareness, supporting more than 2,000 network infrastructure devices. This from a Fortinet perspective, because it was a third-party acquisition, long history in the marketplace of meeting and supplying, multitude of multi-vendor networks sitting out there. We have that capability of identifying for that. And it's not reliant on the 802.1x, nothing wrong with that, but there's a little bit more of an overhead you have to consider sometimes when you're implementing that security capabilities. I also like to use the analogy, once again, about, identifying products. Think about you go into the store, back to my, old world, right? They physically have to inventory everything to know, right? It's like, what do I have in my store? What's my inventory? Now, obviously, with more modern day solutions, most products have barcodes on it. We can be machine readable. You can see all that information and gain a ton of information. While device identification in Fortinet is not based on barcodes, but we can determine, once again, via these metrics, these 17 previously defined aspects, you can have a very good categorization of what all the devices are in your environment. The benefit of gaining all this information is the reporting and analytics, right? So we have a live inventory of network connections as replicated coming in, and then we also have historical inventory of the network connections. Very powerful to understand. It's like, this is part of the information collected for the devices coming in. Does it continue to behave and act like it has in the future for its functionality? So you can examine trends about devices, users, duration of connections. Even, one network element is your wireless access points. So here we have an example of this dashboard that has a ton of reports you can get from this console to help meet, your director CXO level reporting capabilities for various PCI compliance and so on. And certainly very specific as the common operating system for most endpoints, workstations, laptops is Windows, is extensive capability to understand and have a collection. I've got 2,000 devices in my network, and 1,999 are all up to date, but there's one that's missing a particular security build or features. So our elements of our network control system, specifically Fortinet, is we have the functionality of control and application, and that can be done via a hardware appliance, a virtual appliance. Scale and grow as you have maybe multitude of devices. You can have a central manager for overlooking all the individual components. And then a tiered licensing capability is shown here for the Fortinet license levels. So this is the functionality, not for software that you're putting on there on endpoints, whatever, but it's the ability to how far do I want to take the functions. Most people go with a plus. Sometimes, moving into the pro then adds further capabilities of the response functions. So I often open with this, right, talking about why we need NAC and, the zero trust premise and watching every node in the network. And what I talk about is NAC is the solution of what IP and networking should have had from the beginning. If you look historically, if, think about way back when of the IP network, right? It was a closed network for the most part. It was just for military and then for higher ed institutions. So there was a very defined level of trust that I knew who my users were that would be connected on this network. Well, then it became very much commercialized and more public. So now the protocol itself didn't have all the hooks in there to say, how do I make sure that, what I'm carrying on my particular flow is actually who it should be. And certainly then you look at the operating systems. We unfortunately know how many years we've been struggling with vulnerabilities of Windows and others, right? Because if you go back, in time when they were initially created, it was never assumed, never thought about that these would be so widely accessible on a network on that capability. So Fortinet now is kind of that overlay infrastructure. It's like, yeah, we should have had this to begin with, but we don't. And because security needs to be so pervasive, these are the control mechanisms we need on your network. So two quick deployment examples. This was the healthcare one I mentioned. And the salient point that when I first heard this example was, example given was someone in a lab, right, in one of the offices. We've all heard the phrase, I know just enough to be dangerous. Well, that's pretty common with people and computers and networks. In his lab environment, he needed a network connectivity closer to his machines, and the machines happened to be Wi-Fi enabled. So he just went and bought a generic access point, didn't give a squat about security parameters, whatever. Simple and easy, plugged it in. Well, without any security authentication for that access point, blew a hole wide open in regards to people that could connect on that access point and have direct connection on the network. So never would anyone in a CXO position want to have that call. It's like, how did a vulnerability like that get on my network? Well, it got on the network because there was an automated control response system to say, I don't recognize this device. I'm going to not allow it. And another example is the smart building, the Internet of Things. This happened to be a large financial company, and it was really about they're going with the plus version and the microsegmentation and the inventory reports. So my conclusion is to point you to, specific to Fortinet, obviously, is our Fortinet Network Access Control. It's on the public site, and you can get a very variety of information, like white papers, ebooks, and so on. That's what I have for content. Thank you very much for having me on. And are there any additional questions?
Thank you, Jeff. There are a few questions in the chat box. I'll read it out to you. The first question is by Ray Rivera. Let me just scroll back to it. Where's the question? Oh, here it is. He asks about multiple offices. So if you have multiple offices and multiple locations, do you need to deploy multiple NAC appliances or FortiNAC appliances to the remote offices?
Yes and no. It should be a fairly common response from an engineer, right? It all depends. I would say at a high level, certainly scoping out the appropriate application and control server, right? We need to understand how many devices, ports, and switches and so on are on there. So once that's scoped out and you have, you know, a high-speed redundant network between these associated remote sites, you wouldn't necessarily have to replicate all these services in the remote locations. They can be more centralized. If latency, network susceptibility becomes an issue, then we have the ability to scale and have triage of different devices in your network. So wouldn't necessarily at all be required to have those devices sitting in every single physical location.
All right. Next question is by Kyle. Kyle asks, if a NAC uses passive reads via services such as SNMP to discover endpoints, does FortiNAC allow active control over such endpoints, such as SSH? If so, can FortiNAC allow broad changes to supported devices, for example, broad VLAN changes based on model? So kind of technical
Yes.
question, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, very much. Simple answer is, quick answer is yes. A more detailed answer is with the multi-vendor support, and Cisco's a big one, right? It obviously has had a huge market share gain over several years for switches and routers. So as long as the credentials are provided and we have the capabilities to do configuration real-time commands, so we can go out and say, on this particular port, I'm going to set dynamic VLAN to be a new VLAN so that information, because I've identified profile, what the device is, I'm going to automatically change that in the infrastructure. So we have a wide variety of support for that capability.
Awesome. Rick has a question around some capabilities. He asks, is there a capability to manually add a network device that might not be in the supported list of devices for those approved one-off devices that we may have?
Yes. So that's a little bit of the pre-production homework, the capability, right? Because as new things are added in, right? It's like, this is unrecognized in the profiling, right? The default profiling. Well, I know what it is, and I have verified the information about that. So I'm going to create a profile that says if we see this, and I always start with the vendor OUI at the MAC address because that's easy. But then these other characteristics, that if we go out to the device via SMP or other facets, can we get further discernible information, which we can guarantee will make the identification of that device unique. So once all that's identified, you just add that, and then subsequent devices will automatically match that profile and be added or controlled or reported on in your network.
All right. We have one last question in the chat room, and guys, feel free to write more questions as we go through this, or if you want to ask, you can ask to unmute yourself and we'll unmute you. You can ask the questions as well. So Mike Leather has a question. Does NAC also see when a device connects to your network via VPN?
Yes. So it would be in communication with, so there the benefit, especially expanding the scope of the discussion. Since I got the floor, I'm going to kind of make it my spin, but I see a VPN information coming in via a FortiGate. So that the FortiGate, right, would be identifying who the user is through not necessarily network admission control, but, you know, two-factor authentication and so on, then associated in the appropriate policy routes to that firewall, but then that can be further communicated and reported upon within the NAC, in the NAC. So maybe not so much as a control, but certainly from a reporting mechanism.
Follow-up question is, what about Kaspersky VPN or let's make it a little bit broader, does it only identify based on Fortinet's VPN client or any other VPNs, or is it like a mix?
No, it's definitely multi-vendor. I mean, underlying VPN is all standards-based, right? Where you, for the most part, where you terminate the functionality on. So as long as we can get the information from your VPN hub, right, your termination point, right, we can get information out via command line interface, other diagnostics, and that can be part of the profiling information within Fortinet.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, for that question. And I believe what you mentioned, Jeff, earlier about defense in depth plays a very critical role here. That NAC alone will not solve all of cybersecurity problems. Obviously, that's why you have security frameworks in place. But using that with other solutions, like you clearly mentioned, multi-factor authentication when using VPN, blocking off certain IPs, endpoint segmentation and all those things. So once you put everything into the mix and have an overall broader approach to access control, then I believe you have a much better posture and a much better chance of protecting yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that's all the questions that were in the Q&A.
I have one.
Oh, you have one more. Go ahead.
I do too. This is from Tim. How is this product licensed? Is it by number of devices, number of ports protected, or something that you guys just make up?
Yeah, there's a mechanism to identify, or in some cases, it's a swag, right? Because it's difficult sometimes, right? It's like I know I've got 10 switches, they're 48 ports, right? So 480 ports and so on, and these particular users, right? So you start with a baseline of licensing in the functionality, and then that can be increased. So it's definitely looking at ports and users that you believe are on your network and licensing for that connectivity. And then additional user functionality licenses will go on and say, once I've identified the user and I want to have the mechanism to do an automated response function within that, that's the tiered level of the 3 levels of the licensing for the functionality on that. But first and foremost, looking at the devices, ports, and users.
All right.
And these are, Kim, do you have any other questions in your chat?
That's all
Okay.
I've got.
Great. And these are all great questions, and feel free to reach out to the Mindsight team to get a free consultation around network security or cybersecurity in general. And I'm sure there will be more questions once we dive deeper into the solutions and try to understand your specific use case. And with Jeff's help, we can definitely discuss requirements of when and where NAC fits in to resolve these issues. We can even arrange demos, proof of concepts, network visibility assessments with Fortinet, with Fortinet in general. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and let's have that discussion. With that, I'll close this, but before I do, I'll announce the winners of the gift cards. So we have 2 gift cards to give out, and so we've randomly decided based on questions. Edward Clark is one of the winners, and Kyle Fries, I hope I pronounced it right, Kyle Fries. So Edward and Kyle are the 2 winners. Congratulations, and our marketing team will be reaching out to you for those gift cards. Thank you very much for sticking around, and again, reach out to our AEs and myself, and we will have those follow-up discussions. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.